Hello, how are you doing? As you probably know, I can very easily get swept up in the excitement of the Booker Prize and reading all the novels on the long list. Also, August is Women in Translation Month, and there are books I want to read for that. But there are also some really exciting looking new books coming out that I want to try to get to as well. So I have quite a big reading list this month, but lots of exciting things to look forward to. So I have a stack of new books that publishers have kindly sent me, and I'm going to go through and talk through all of them. I'd love to know if you've read any of these books and would recommend them, or if you're interested in reading any of them now. Let me know in the comments below, or if you've got any new books recently, new purchases that you're really looking forward to reading. I'd be glad to hear about those as well. So first off, there is a new book by BookTube's very own Marc Nash, which is called Stories We Tell Our Children. This is a novel and a book of interlinked short stories, which, as I've talked about in the past, is sort of my favorite form of fiction. And the story is about how the stories that we are told when we are children, and it focuses on a boy who's sort of forming his identity through the stories he's told as a child, but how these stories come from sort of unreliable narrators, and he has to sort of sift through the truth to understand, what's real and what's really going on in the situation of his life. And the cover of this is so interesting because it's this sort of animated scene which looks very innocent on the surface when you just sort of glance at it, but then when you look at it more closely, you see that pages are being torn out of this book and then fed by the child into the fire. So I think it's such a striking image, and Marc Nash made a video talking about the cover of this book, and I really enjoy watching his channel and his responses to what he's been reading. He always has really interesting opinions and insights about the books that he's been reading, especially because he's a writer himself and has produced a number of novels. And so I'm really looking forward to reading this. The Island of Missing Trees by Elif Shafak. And I really enjoy her writing. I've read a couple of her novels in the past. And so yeah, I always look forward to her new fiction. And this is a story set on Cyprus and in a tavern in the city where two friends meet. One of them is Greek Cypriot and one of them is Turkish Cypriot. And if you don't know much about the country of Cyprus, it's very much divided, sort of split between these two different cultures, which have a very tumultuous past to them. And so during the wartime, these friends are split from each other, and many years later the child of one of their friends who's grown up in London returns back to Cyprus and tries to learn more about the past, as well as a reconnection between these two people who met early on in this tavern. And in the tavern a fig tree was growing there, and a clipping from that fig tree was taken to London and sort of grown into a new tree, which is why there's a fig tree on the cover of this novel. And yeah, I think her writing is so insightful and meaningful in a political way, but just also talking about our human culture. And so yeah, looking forward to this. With Teeth by Kristen Arnett. This is a novel about a woman who works from home in Florida, and she's raising a son, and they have a very strained relationship with each other. And as he gets older, that grows increasingly more fraught and difficult. And also she has an absent wife, mostly absent wife, and so it's about their strained relationship as well. And yeah, and I think it's so interesting, how she wants to have this sort of idealistic queer family, but that the reality of that just isn't the case. And I think that's such a unique point of view and story that I'm really eager to read about. I'd meant to read this author's previous novel called Mostly Dead Things, and just didn't get around to it. And so yeah, that's a book I want to get to as well. But I've heard such great things about this new book that I'm hoping to read this soon. You Will Never Be Forgotten by Maryse. And this has a very striking cover to it. it. This is a collection of short stories. A lot of the stories are about our relationship with technology and how our relationship with technology can sort of distance us from each other, but then also make these surprising moments of connection with each other, and some very like tender moments, and I think that's such a like interesting perspective. And I really haven't read all that many short stories recently, other than some that I've been reading aloud to my partner, and so yeah, I think this is a collection that I'd like to sort of dip into and read some of the stories over time. And also, this book and author have been like massively praised by Douglas Stewart, who said of this book, "One of the most luminous, funny, totally thought-provoking story collections I have ever read." So quite high praise. There's also a new edition of the literary review Granta. This is their summer issue, and each edition of their magazine that comes out centers around a theme or a topic. And so the topic for this one is interiors, and they always publish a really interesting group of writers, like some well-known writers like Jessie Ball and Claire Louise Bennett, and also there's new nonfiction by Sandra Newman. And so yeah, I always enjoy like reading through this magazine, and there's some really striking photographs in it as well, so it's, you know, a good thing to flip through and read through and browse. Then I have a couple of books of literary nonfiction, or well, kind of literary nonfiction. So there's this new book, Borges and Me by J. Parini, and this is, I think it's like technically a novel, but it's heavily based on the author's own life, because when he was a young man growing up in America, he tried to escape from having to enlist in the Vietnam War by moving to Scotland. And when he was in Scotland, the author George Louis Borges happened to also be in Scotland. And at this point, Borges was a very old man, and J. Parini was quite a young man. And so they met, and Borges's translator had to go away somewhere, and Parini was left sort of looking after and taking care of Borges. And they went on this kind of road trip together. It sounds like such a wild, like dream-like sort of situation, which is, I think, is sort of reflective of kind of Borges's type of fiction. And I've not read all that much by Borges before. I think I've read some of his stories, but yeah, haven't read him that like comprehensively. But he's an author that I've always been interested in, and this is such a sort of curious literary encounter. And J. Parini has written a number of novels, a lot, and biographies, sort of, you know, inspired by the lives of authors in the past. I think he's written like a big novel about Herman Melville before, and so this sounds like such an enjoyable, curious story. Then there is Writing in the Dark by Will Loxley, and this is definitely a nonfiction book about writers and artists in London during World War II, and how these people were supposed to enlist in the military and go to war. And so it talks about the conflicts in their lives, but how they also started a new literary magazine called Horizon during this time, which seems an incredible thing to do during wartime. So it's talking about a number of different members that formed this magazine, but also members that formed the Bloomsbury Group. And I find this period of history fascinating, you know, especially this period of like literary history. And so, you know, I read the book Square Haunting earlier this year about a number of female writers, all centered around this area of London during this time, or like early 20th century, and so yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading this. I also have a couple other nonfiction books which both happen to center around World War II and Germany. So first off, there is All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days by Rebecca Donner, and this is a nonfiction book and sort of biography about a woman named Mildred Harnack, who was an American woman that when she was 26 years old, she embarked on a PhD program and moved to Berlin, and this was in the late 1930s. So she saw the rise of Hitler and this whole fascist movement and the beginning of World War II, and she became a resistance fighter to this, helping to smuggle Jewish people out of Germany and working, against Hitler, and so became really entangled in the whole war, and she became a spy. And so, yeah, quite an extraordinary story, and as an individual I've not heard about from history before, and I think it's so fascinating how, even though there's been so much written about World War II, there's still so many of these fascinating stories emerging of real acts of heroism, in the face of this like horrible evil, and so yeah, it sounds like such a fascinating story. It's quite a long book, but one that I think sounds really worthwhile. Then there is Tunnel 29 by Helena Merriman, and this is a nonfiction book taking place after World War II in Berlin, when the city was still divided into the east and west by the wall, and a group of students in West Berlin who were tunneling through to East Berlin to try to create a passage for people that wanted to come through to the west side. And so yeah, the extraordinary story of these students digging this tunnel and how their mission was sort of foiled by a spy that infiltrated their group. So it sounds like quite an extraordinary story. I think this author hosted a podcast that was about this same subject, and so this is a book about that experience. Crying in the H Mart by Michelle Zauner, and this is a memoir which a lot of people have been talking about, has such a striking cover to it, and it's about the author's life, who was a musician, and she grew up in the Midwest of America and was one of the only Asian people in her community, and so had quite like, as she was getting older, had quite like a distant connection with her Korean heritage, and but when she was in her mid-20s, she wanted to really reconnect with this past of hers, and through the art of cooking, and so yeah, it tells that story, and I love stories about like food and culture, and I've heard so many great things about this that yeah, it sounds like such a moving book. And also the publisher sent with a copy of the book some recipes for Korean dishes, and so I think these would be really fun to try alongside reading this memoir. Then I have a group of novels that all happen to be translated from the French, and which I think sound really good. So first off, there's Waiting for the Waters to Rise by Maryse Conde, who's the winner of the Alternative Nobel Prize, which is an award I haven't really heard of before, but Maryse Conde is an author that I've always wanted to read, and this is set in the country of Guadeloupe, where the author was born, and it's the story of a man who very much misses his mother and his ex-lover, and he comes across a girl that is a sort of refugee from the war in Haiti, and so he takes charge of her and cares for her and travels back to Haiti. And I've really fascinated to read about the country of Haiti, because I've read a couple of other books that are either set there or center around Haitian culture, and so yeah, it's a story that I'd be really curious to read. The Country of Others by Leila Slimani, and this is a novel which is the first part of a proposed trilogy that the author is writing, or maybe she's already written it all in French, and it's now just being translated into English for the first time. But I've read this author's novel Lullaby before, and yeah, actually I read her second novel that was translated into English as well, and yeah, I think she's a really interesting writer, and so I'd be keen to read this. And this the story of a French woman that meets and falls in love with a Moroccan soldier, I think in the mid 20th century, and they move to Morocco, and try to start a life for themselves there, but she finds herself increasingly alienated from the people around her. So it's about the struggle of their relationship, and so yeah, it sounds really good, and yeah, it'd be quite exciting to get in on the first part of a trilogy of Fangs and Talons by Nicolas Mathieu. And this novel was the winner of the Prix Goncourt Prize. Maybe it's just my perception, but it feels like every French writer has won the Prix Goncourt at some point. Maybe that's just my perception because those are the authors that get translated into English. But anyway, this is the story of a community where most of the people in the community are employed by this local factory. But when that factory closes down, some of the citizens of this community are driven to desperate measures, and a group of them plot a kidnapping, which goes wrong. So it follows this like dramatic story, which sounds quite gripping. Damnation Spring by Davidson. This is the story of a family in California. The father, his business is felling great redwood trees to sell, and his son wants to get into the business as well, but his father wants another life for him, and the son sees an opportunity to purchase some land and some trees, but there's something very sinister going on with this land that he purchases, and so it's the story of that. And so yeah, it sounds like quite a tantalizing story, and I've always been interested in like the logging industry, like in a weird way. I think it was ever since like I watched the movie The Journey of Natty Gann when I was younger. Did anybody else ever see that movie? I think it's such a like beautiful, like gritty story of a daughter and her father, and I mean this has nothing to do with that, and it's probably nothing like that, but it sort of reminds me of that, and so sometimes we can be interested in these books for quite like random reasons. Paul by Daisy Lafarge. This is a debut novel about a woman that is a graduate student who goes to live and work on an eco farm one summer in rural France, and there she falls for the owner of this eco farm, and they have a relationship with each other and decide to go on a road trip together, and their relationship becomes very tumultuous, and so it's following that journey. And I love a good road trip novel, and I've heard great things about this debut, so yeah, this is a new author I'd like to try. Sugar by Bernice L. McFadden. I've talked about this novel before, how I'm really anticipating this, and I initially thought it was a new novel, but somebody commented saying this was actually the author's debut novel, and but it's being published here in the UK for the very first time, and I really enjoyed this author's previous book. Was it called The Flight of the Butterfly, something of the butterfly? Praise Song for the Butterflies, that's what it was called. And this novel is about a woman that moves to a southern town hoping to escape her past, but then finds she becomes a figure of gossip there, and her past sort of catches up with her, but she forms this strong friendship with a neighbor over while eating sweet potato pie together, and I just love the sort of sound and feel of that story, and I thought she's such a striking writer that I've been really curious to read more of her work. She's published a whole range of novels, and so yeah, I'm quite keen to read this. And then finally there is The Plot by Jean Hanff Korelitz, and this is a thriller, and I'm not often all that interested in reading thrillers, but I think the story of this sounds really enticing. So it's about a man that was a really promising young writer that published a debut that got a lot of attention, but then over the years he didn't really publish anything else, and he became a creative writing teacher, and he has one student that is very promising and talented and produces a manuscript which he submits to the teacher, but then the student unexpectedly dies, and the teacher decides to take this manuscript and publish it as his own, and the novel does become very famous, but then he gets an anonymous message saying, "You are a thief," and so it's following the tension of that story, and so it sounds like quite a fun sort of play on like literary culture and the ambition to be a great writer and all of that, and also it's highly praised by Stephen King, and so I think this would be a really fun new novel to read. So those are all the books I want to talk about. Hopefully I'll get to reading some of them this month in addition to all the other reading that I'm doing. But like I said, if you're interested in reading any of these books, or if you've read any of them yourself, let me know in the comments below, and we can have a chat about it. But hope you're reading good things, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.